Welcome to the official podcast of the MiddleEastVoices.com community. I'm David Hutchins.
And I'm Cecily Hillary, joining you for our weekly podcast at MiddleEastVoices.com. Middle East Voices is our new social journalism and engagement platform for the Arab Spring. And today we're taking a look at our two big stories, Syria and Egypt.
That's right. Now, later on in the show, my colleague Susan Yaki spoke with senior reporter Mohammed El-Shanawi. El-Shanawi just returned from Egypt for an extended trip, and that's his home country. El-Shanawi witnessed the new Tahrir protests leading up to the historic elections taking place now, where moderate and conservative Islamists look poised to control the nation's parliament. In fact, Mohammed is talking to the leadership of those two parties as we speak to find out how they plan to rule.
Interesting. But first we're going to discuss Syria. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad has denied that he ordered the killing of thousands of anti-government protesters. He told a U.S. journalist he does not control the forces implementing his country's crackdown. And in a rare interview that aired Wednesday, Mr. Assad told ABC News that although he's president, he does not, quote, own the country, so they're not his forces.
Now, Cecily, you've been talking to a lot of people this week about the Assad presidency and the regime. You spoke to Captain Iyad Dik, who is a defected soldier who was in the Syrian armed forces and has gone over to the Free Syria Army. And then also Colonel Riyad al-Assad, who is the commander of the Free Syria Army. Of course, they're seeking to overthrow the regime. Yeah,
I also spoke with retired Brigadier General Akil Hashem. He lives outside of Syria today. He outlined for me basically what he calls a prescription for ousting Bashar al-Assad based on his years serving in the Syria armed forces and living in Syria.
And you can catch all of these interviews in English and in Arabic at MiddleEastVoices.com. So what we thought we would do with this week's show is do an at-issue debate. And an at-issue debate, if you've been on the site, is basically a spirited discussion we have with two people on opposing sides of an issue. And then we post these interviews online, both audio and transcription, to find out who people agree with the most through a poll.
Now, today's issue is the following. Do you support the presidency of Bashar al-Assad? And should he step down or be removed from power?
So joining us on the line is Rafif Jujati. She is a Syrian-American activist who is working to expose human rights violations taking place in Syria. She works with activists in Syria and opposition abroad, and she also serves as the English language spokesperson for the local coordination committees, or the LCC, of Syria. And also on the line from Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates is Ali Mohammed, who is editor of the Syrian Tribune, an online publication that supports the Assad presidency. He also writes about political Islamic movements in the Africa and the Middle East. Thank you both for joining us.
Welcome to both of you. I'd like to just throw out a few ground rules here. Please make your case with reasoned arguments and be respectful. Also, there are two sides to any issue, and what we want from you is to just state your case. And you may address one another as well as us. And as I said, our community will be voting on your cases online.
All right, let's begin. So this is the first question, and this is basically like an opening statement. First, we'd like a 60-second statement of why you support or do not support the current presidency of Bashar al-Assad. And so, Rafif, I'd like to start with you. We'll get about 60 seconds on the clock, and then we want to hear from Ali.
Okay, thank you. I don't support Bashar al-Assad because I and many millions of Syrians are fed up with 4 decades of military dictatorship. We're fed up of 4 decades of having our country being treated like a family farm. More importantly, with the recent events in Syria, we are fed up with a government firing on unarmed protesters and killing all kinds of civilians and children.
We'll go ahead and have Ali respond. What in 60 seconds or less, Ali, do you support the presidency of Bashar al-Assad and why?
Thanks. Actually, the question to me is not whether or not I support the president himself. The question right now at this critical moment in the Syrian history is whether or is what I choose as the better choice for Syria. And this is not regarding choosing Assad himself or not. It's choosing Assad's line at times and mostly avoiding what would be a much worse situation than what my colleague called dictatorship.
I'm going to follow up on that. So are you saying, Ali, that you don't necessarily support Assad, the person, but you support the stability in the country? And because I'm confused, obviously stability comes from he being in power. So are you basically not in support of the revolution and the uprising, but have issues with Assad?
That's a better way of saying it. Yes, I am not in support of the uprising, and siding with Assad at this moment is not because Assad means this much to Syria, it's because Syria means this much to Syrians. I do not support the uprising or the so-called revolution. I am siding with Assad at the moment. I was not before the revolution, and I may stop siding with him after the revolution.
Ali, I'd like to pose a question to you, and we'll throw it out to Rafif afterwards. 4,000 people are dead, and that's, by some estimates, a conservative estimate. For example, when I talked to General Hashim, he said it could be twice that number or more. Now, somebody is doing the killing. We hear from one side that it is the regime, the military, and the Shabiha. We hear from others, the other side, that it is armed terrorists supported from the outside. I pose the question to you, who is doing the killing?
Well, it's kind of a mixture of both stories. There's no doubt that security forces did shoot at protesters. This is something I personally regret, and it pains me that I am siding with the side that did that. Yet, this is not the only thing that happened. There is also no doubt that armed gangs did shoot. I have proof. I know people who served in the military during the events, who are still serving in the military during the events. I know military injured personnel who got shot in such situations. And my brother, working at the hospital in Banyas, he witnessed some of the killing himself as early as the 10th of April.
Rafif, I wanted you to respond to that. Do you think there are other armed elements? It's basically all innocent, peaceful protesters that have been protesting and then died in this conflict? Are there armed elements, and does it even matter?
What I can tell you is that the protests have been largely peaceful. Since the beginning of the revolution, the protesters on the ground adopted silmiye, which means peaceful, peaceful. And in fact, in many instances, were offering flowers and drinking water to the soldiers that were coming at them. So the majority of the killing has been perpetrated by the security forces and the Shabiha. It's important to note that the Shabiha are usually dressed in plain clothes, but they're armed. It's also important to note that in every major city in Syria, there are tanks stationed throughout the towns and cities. There are snipers on rooftops taking shot at civilians as they go about any sort of daily business they're allowed to go about. Certainly, there may be some people who have taken up arms. We have to expect that people have the right to self-defense. And so I say that anybody who's taken up arms, any civilians who've taken up arms, are defending themselves and their families.
I'd like to go back to what Ali said. You say that we talk about armed groups. It's a shadowy term. Who are the armed groups? Who are these armed terrorists?
And if I could jump in, Cecily, that would be a perfect question for Ali. Who are these armed gangs? We've been told, we as activists have been told that they are Islamic radicals. We've been told that they're Americans. We've been told that they're Al Jazeera reporters. And we've been told that they're the French.
Ali?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure who told you this. I wasn't told that. But I will answer your question and at the same time offer a counter debate to what you said. You said that protesters adopted silmiye from the early beginnings. Well, I can't think of early beginnings earlier than the 10th of April. At that day, my own brother witnessed the horribly mutilated body of a person whose name is now quite famous in Syria, Nidal Jannoud. My own brother received the corpse at Banyas National Hospital, and this guy was tortured horribly. Later on, video leaked, many videos leaked actually, some photos as well. I was the one who saw the photo the first time, and I sent it to my brother for verification, and it turned out to be the same person. And we saw clearly in those videos, if you go back to my blog, in one of the articles I wrote about this, it's called The Syrian Revolution Under the Bonnet. The videos are there, and you see clearly that those who killed them, who were carrying weapons, are the same people who were on shoulders yelling Silmiye, Silmiye in protests in Banyas. That was the 10th of April. I can't think of any earlier date. This is an example of what happened in other places as well. We witnessed horrible things in many places, and the fact is, carrying weapons has been a norm from the beginning. It was not an exception. It was not a personal attitude or, as you named it, protecting oneself.
Do you feel that the 4,000 deaths, as quoted by the UN, in excess of 4,000 deaths, is an accurate figure? Because Assad says it's not in his interview with Barbara Walters this week. So that's my first question to you. And then the second question is, there is a plethora of online video evidence to show that there have been horrendous torture. I mean, you know the case, of course, of the young Hamza al-Khatib, who was tortured. And so even if there may be the existence of armed groups, there's clearly overwhelming evidence, even the defected soldier that talked to Cecily, who was told he was ordered to fire on civilians. Do you contest any of that other information, conceding that, yes, there may be armed gangs there?
Well, first to comment on what you said, that it began as a peaceful protest. Well, I'll give you 2 weeks of peaceful protest from March 25th to April 10th when Nidal Janud was killed. So that's 2 weeks. I think it's a bit too short in the history of a country like Syria with 7,000 years of history. To answer your first question, you said, do I believe that the number is 4,000? I don't have any means by which I can verify whether the number is correct or not, but I lean towards not believing that this number is correct, mainly because the main source of this number, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, is a source that I don't trust. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's 1,000 more or 1,000 less. This is Syrian blood. This is regrettable. This should not happen, and whether it's 100 or 1,000, it's the same to me. One innocent person killed is enough pain for a whole country.
Rafeef, why don't you respond to that?
Absolutely. I'd like to respond to something that Ali said earlier. He traced the revolution back to April of this year, and I'd like to rewind a little bit from there when a group of teenagers in Daraa scrawled some graffiti on the school walls saying, "Ashab yurid isqat al-nizam," or the people want to topple the regime. Those children were arrested, detained, tortured, and returned to their families as an example. By torture, I'm saying that their fingernails were pulled out and their hands were smashed. There are many, many instances like these that point to peaceful civilians expressing themselves and being treated with brutality in return. So we need to go back to February and start documenting from there. With
May I respond to this point, please?
Well, I'd like to answer the question, if you don't mind, since I gave you the floor. In response to the question about the number of deaths, I think 4,000 is a very conservative number. I imagine it's more likely to be double that, and that number is just deaths that have been documented. I myself participate in a documentation effort, and we track deaths by name, age, location of death, how they died, whether or not they were tortured or simply shot. We document their family circumstances and the loved ones they've left behind. So I can assure you that what is being published, whether it's by the Syrian Observatory or the local coordination committees, is only published after extensive documentation.
Let's agree that 4,000 people are dead, many tortured by whomever. All of this has happened on Bashar al-Assad's watch. He has not been able to stop it. Should he or should he not assume responsibility and step down?
The trap that was set in asking this question, do you accept responsibility? The president cannot come on TV, on an American TV. I am responsible, because the next step would be the American spokesperson, the American Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson, asking him, if you are responsible, why don't you step down?
I think the question, Ali, was...
Let me restate the question for a second, because we are running out of time. But basically, what do you think Assad's fate will be?
May I take that?
Let me just give you three options to make this as succinct as possible. What do you think Assad's fate will be? If you look at the other Arab Spring dictators, basically result in either victory, meaning staying in power and eventually putting this down. Well, you may see that happen in Bahrain. Death is what you saw in Libya, or being brought to justice is what you're seeing with Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, or perhaps with Mubarak. Given these three choices, what do you think will happen to Assad ultimately?
I actually think he'll be tried for crimes against humanity and then put to death.
So you're saying he will be tried?
Can you repeat what you said, Cecily? I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm asking what do you think will be Assad's ultimate fate? Victory, death, or being brought to justice?
Yeah, well, if I may answer that, what matters to me is the fate of Syria, and I will give you three options. Would it be a foreign intervention that would destroy the country the same way that happened in Libya or Iraq? Would it be a civil war that would destroy the country the same way it happened in Lebanon? Or would it be surviving this crisis to what is best for the Syrian people? And I would vote for the third one. This is not wishful thinking. This is something I am working for with my colleagues, and I am hoping that my colleague would also concur. You cannot force me to answer this question. The question is not whether what Assad's fate will be. You will be doing Assad a big service if you link his fate to Syria's fate, because then me and millions of others would be defending his fate because we are defending our country's fate. What we care for is Syria surviving this crisis without foreign intervention, without civil war, with what is best for the Syrian people. And anything else is questionable. What will happen in the future is left for the Syrian people. Number one concern is let Syria pass this crisis.
If I could just very quickly, I know you're short on time, I would say that Assad has really already abdicated authority. The rest is just a process. By denying any responsibility for the killings under his watch, by saying that he's not in control of his own armed forces, by not ever answering the question of who these armed gangs are, by refusing to comment on the current situation in Syria, he's abdicated leadership. The fate of Syria is not tied to the fate of Assad. Assad is a mere point in Syria's history, so Syria will survive this, will get past this once he's prosecuted and presumably put to death, and will move on in the process of rebuilding itself.
We have to leave it both there. Thank you very much for a very well-argued and spirited discussion with us. We hope we can do that again. We'll be posting this online shortly. That's Rafeef Jujati, the local coordination committees of Syria, and also Ali Mohammed, editor of SyrianTribune.com. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
As we mentioned earlier, our colleague Mohammed El-Shinawi just returned from an extended stay in Egypt. He sat down for a chat with our Susan Yaki to explain the mood in Egypt during this democratic spring.
Joining me now is VOA's Susan Yaki, and I think she's going to make me make good on a promise I made a while ago.
Well, I thought I would, Mohammed. And by the way, welcome back to Washington from your extended visit to Egypt. A month, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Before we get to your make good, with all that is going on in Egypt, the Arab Spring, elections, protests against the military government, what is the attitude among the Egyptians you spoke with?
Actually, most intellectuals I talk to are so pessimistic about the intentions of the Supreme Military Council of the Armed Forces, or SCAF. They cite several justifications for that negative perspective. One, SCAF wasted almost 10 months without a clear roadmap to transfer power to an elected civil government. Two, SCAF tried to outsmart the people by inserting items in the so-called super constitution guidelines that would have amounted to make the army the source of authority and power and not the people. Three, as they were pressured by Tahrir Square masses, they went ahead with an expedited timetable that would make it possible for a civilian government to take over by June of next year instead of the end of 2013 as previously announced. Finally, when elections started, they surprised everyone by insisting that the elected parliament would only select a commission to draft the new constitution but will not form the new government. So many analysts in Cairo believe the new battle over power would be between SCAF and the new parliament.
But why are the generals clinging to power when they had originally promised to pass it on to civilians in 6 months?
Well, Susan, since the Camp David Accords in 1979 with no potential war with Israel, the military turned its energy to economic enterprises. We have seen army generals ran farms, factories, mining projects, hotels, and commercial projects. It is estimated that they control now up to 25% of the Egyptian economy. So with the revolution, people are asking questions about military privileges, and that's why the generals are trying to keep their unmatched influence and maintain their economic interests.
And now that make good. Before you left for Egypt, you and I spoke about the humor of the Egyptian people, even during the midst of riots in Tahrir Square. And you promised to bring us back a report about if that good sense of humor continues.
It does. Actually, out of fear that Islamists are bound to take over Egypt, Egyptians started making fun of the future parliament and the competition between liberals and strict militant Salafis. One famous liberal in Egypt is Professor Amr Hamzawi, who won one district by a landslide against an Islamist, while more Islamists are winning the elections. Hamzawi has a long hair, and Salafis are wearing long beards. So a cartoon depicted the new parliament with one representative with long hair and the rest with long beards. So Egyptians are joking that the ideological difference inside the new parliament would be whether to grow hair or grow beards. Other Egyptians are joking that the Beltway in Cairo would soon change its name under Islamists to the straight path, which leads to heaven according to the Islamic belief.
Well, I'm glad to hear they still have their sense of humor. Thanks, Mohammed.
Thank you, Susan. That's VOA's Susan Yaki in the studio with me.
And that's it for our latest Middle East Voices podcast. We'd love to have your input on how to improve the show. Join our community on VOA Middle East Voices on Facebook and post your thoughts directly on the wall. Also, why not become a fan of that page and find out more about our new social journalism and engagement platform.
And join us on Twitter and, of course, MiddleEastVoices.com to keep the dialogue going with members of our team. We'll see you next time.